How was everyone? How was your weekend? Today is my Monday, so. Good weekend? Yeah? Did you guys get outside? It's pretty warm. Wasn't too bad. Warm for Michigan in February, anyway. Good question for you guys, sort of an informal poll, because every once in a while, the university will have sort of like kind of like a presentation on like a random evening. Your professor says, hey, you go, you write up a paragraph, get extra credit. Most of you are freshmen, actually, aren't you? Okay, well this happens periodically. A speaker will come do a thing. What would you be most inclined to be interested in listening to? Someone speaking about the national debt, U.S.-China relations, or the history of conservatism in the United States since World War II. Which one? So option A, which kind of you raise your hands. Option A, the national debt. Option B, U.S.-China relations. Option C, history of American conservatism since World War II. So option A, national debt. Option B, U.S.-China relations. Okay. Option C, history of American conservatism since World War II. Okay, cool. All right, I'll keep that in mind. Let me see here. I'm supposed to be giving something, and I need a topic, and those are three things that I write about, and okay. All right. Let's see, a couple more things before I get started today. So, today, wrapping up European empires, bringing the European states into the 18th century, that is the 1700s. Sort of wrapping up, talking about the two different basic development paths. This is a 100 level course, so we're just going to eliminate all differences except to say that some followed an absolutist path, some followed the path of limited or republican government. It's obviously much more complicated than that, but for a 100 level course, that's basically all we get into. On Thursday, it's going to be all the American Revolution. Not because it is necessarily the most world-changing event, but it is very important, and we are Americans, and I know this is probably going to be one of the events that you know the most about. Yes, because we had American history in high school, right? Okay. Well, what would you say of America's many wars? American Revolution, one you know maybe the most about? Either that or maybe World War II? What do you guys think? Civil War? Okay. Well, we're going to do it. It is kind of an interesting moment in history in terms of counterfactual thinking, meaning thinking about things that did not happen, but which it's very easy to imagine could have happened had London, had Great Britain, granted limited autonomy to the colonies, to the 13 colonies, which is what it would ultimately do later on in what were called the White Dominions. Of course, Britain had many colonies. Some of them were primarily white. Places like Australia, South Africa, New Zealand, Canada. In the 1830s, there's going to be this thing called the Durham Report, where they essentially say, look, as long as they follow London's line on foreign policy, devote troops and resources in the event of a war, who cares if they manage their own internal affairs? And this is exactly the kind of deal that probably the American colonists would have been fine with taking. And so then, you fast forward to, the year 1900. Just imagine now that England controls, Canada, North America, South America's a virtual economic colony, India, Australia. It's just very hard to imagine the German Empire being able to even pick a fight if you believe the Germans were picking a fight there. Just one of those interesting contingent moments of history there. So we'll spend a good deal of time talking about the American Revolution. Next Tuesday, you won't have to come in. I shall simply post the review video. It will, again, this is a 100 level class for all freshmen. I want you to succeed here. This video will consist of me basically going over exactly what I want you to know for the exams. All of the quizzes will be open. So I'm not going to go over the quiz questions. I feel like you can just go and look at the quiz questions and just remember, these exact questions will be on the exam. The same answer choices, like all the same there. And then, so I'll just be going over I believe it's 18 questions that you will not have seen before. It's 18 or 19, I can't remember now. And then for the 20th question, it's a short answer. You'll have 3 options. I'll tell you what your 3 options are, so that ahead of time you can think about, oh, which one of these do I want to answer, and how do I want to answer it? So you're not just sitting down and getting hit with, explain the difference between English and Spanish colonial practices or something like that, if you follow. So you'll get the question ahead of time on Tuesday. There will be 3 options too. So if you don't like one of them, I can remember getting a test and being like, well, I don't mind writing a little paragraph or something about this, but I don't particularly like this question. You'll get to pick one of the 3. So, and then Thursday will be the test. We will be here at our normal time. It is on paper. Paper. It's going to be on paper. So please bring a writing utensil. I will try to remember to bring some extra pens, just in case. Once you're done, you may go. Last time I taught this class, it took anywhere from between like 15 minutes for some people who were really prepared and were just blazing through it to like an hour for others. I don't care how long it takes you. I do insist that you be done by 10:40 because there's another class that starts in here. So if you have any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, that's sort of the next week and a half. So, any questions? Okay, well, let's get into it then. All right, so we're actually going to start right here. That handsome-looking fellow, boy, that's quite the way to dress. So, the development of nation states in Europe. We are moving towards that point here. As mentioned previously, by 1500, Western Europeans were unable to pull themselves together into the type of extensive land empire that we were seeing in Asia at the time, whether it be the Mughals or the Safavids or further east, the Ming. Remember, Europe is politically polycentric, lots of competing power centers. There had been an effort by the Habsburgs. Remember the Holy Roman Empire, that the Habsburgs, basically the German states. But this was really just an alliance. The emperor was very, very weak. It was more feudal than modern. He was reliant entirely on the cooperation of his vassals, his nominal vassals. And remember, the 30 Years' War, that great war of religion that we talked about, the last of the great wars of religion, the Treaty of Westphalia that ends that war, part of the deal there is that it guarantees the autonomy of these 300 little political entities. This had been a major goal of French military intervention in that war, was they feared that Ferdinand, the Habsburg, who was Holy Roman Emperor, that he was going to be able, if he won this war outright, impose himself and centralize and make an absolutist monarchy, like what the French are making right at this exact moment. Okay? So, this is in the mid-17th century, in the mid-1600s, so the Treaty of Westphalia is 1648. Dates to remember for this class: 1453. Well, let's start with the easy one. 1492, what happens? Just shout it out. Yes. 1492, Columbus. Remember that one. That one's an important one. Why were they sailing out into the ocean anyway? What was prompting this? What happened in 1453? 1453. If I remember correctly, this is one of the questions on the exam. 1453. An army takes a very important city, cutting off European access to the Silk Road. 1453, the Ottoman Turks take Constantinople. 1453. That is what happens in that year. This cuts off European access to the wealthiest markets in the world. Remember, Europe at this point is an intellectual, economic backwater. Yes, some of the city-states of Italy, are becoming very prosperous and wealthy, but a lot of this is due to their interaction with these more developed societies of Central and South Asia, the Indian subcontinent, and China. So the cutting off of the trade route, you're looking at it from this way. So Asia, it's coming over the Silk Road. Remember, the Italian merchants from Venice and from Genoa, they would come over to Constantinople, and then they would take the goods back. Well, now all of a sudden, can't do it. So the seaward-facing Iberian peoples, the Spanish and the Portuguese, start sailing around in larger, more seaworthy boats, trying to get access to the East Asian markets. The Portuguese, remember, are trying to sail down the coast of Africa up into the Indian Ocean. This they are doing successfully by the 1470s, 1480s. The Spanish hired this Genoan. I saw this thing the other day that just made me shake my head because it said, who is the most famous person from these individual states? And it took like a poll, and the most famous Spaniard of all time was the Italian Christopher Columbus. So just so you know, he's from Genoa. He's Italian, but he was hired by the King and Queen of Spain, which was Ferdinand and Isabella. Remember Ferdinand and Isabella, the two who unite the two major kingdoms of Spain, Castile and Aragon, and they fuse that together. And then in 1492, as they complete the reconquest, pushing the Muslim Moors out of Granada, reconquering the peninsula, they are also sending him this way, toward the Americas. Okay, what they will discover is the Americas. So, during the 1600s, religion, language, and local culture is going to begin inspiring feelings of regional solidarity that will grow into this idea of separate nationalities. Remember, these kingdoms are very polyglot. You're not a citizen of a nation. You are the subject of a local lord who is the vassal of the king, and pretty much everything about your life is local. All your concerns are local. Your language is local. If you travel, remember, if you were in France and you were in the south of France, you probably spoke something like Savoyard. And if you went to Paris, you would not be able to understand what they were saying. Or if you went to Brittany, if you went to, Gascony. So it's all very, very intensely local. But this is eventually going to grow into national feeling. This is something that's going to be knit together, where in the 1600s, this is going to be the major project of the early 1800s. But it's already starting, especially in places like Spain. We're entering the golden era of Spanish literature. This is Don Quixote. Anybody? Miguel Cervantes. It's the knight who's constantly riding around trying to. He's like mocking the idea of chivalry and stuff because he's sort of this super idealistic poor knight, and he runs around trying to complete quests, but they're all kind of silly. Have you ever heard the expression tilting at windmills? Like trying to do silly, impractical things. Well, he's like trying to, tilting is what you did. You were on a horse and you had a long lance and you would joust, right? You familiar with jousting? Yeah, so there's these giants with these waving arms with their windmills, and he's, my fair maiden, I shall save you from these giants, and he's, tilting at these windmills. So anyway, it's a good book. I'm confident the library has a copy. Some of these nations then organize themselves into absolute monarchies, while others, power is going to be shared among different groups. And in the case of the Dutch and in the case of the English, there's going to be a division of powers by way of constitutional settlements, what we call constitutional settlements. So, the consolidation of the nationality is going to happen over the course of several centuries. By 1500, Europe's 80 million people were divided into about 500 states and principalities. Remember, most of these are in the Holy Roman Empire. There's over 300 of them right there. But 300 years later, Europe's population will have doubled. So from 1500 to 1800, population is going to go from 80 million to 150 million. But the number of political entities is going to shrink from over 500 to about 30. So there's a lot of consolidation going on here. In many of these countries, the idea of divine monarchy and hereditary nobility is going to give way to the sharing of constitutional power between rulers and subjects. Merchants are going to play a huge part in this. Merchants gain a lot of influence and slowly acquire legislative powers. This is important, because we want to think about as power is being concentrated into these larger and larger blocks, You can create larger and larger militaries, but what do militaries cost? Money. Who has the money? Less and less it's about the landed nobility, who are becoming sort of a class with status, but without the requisite wealth that you need. And so, for example, in the case of like France, for example, you also have the problem that you can't tax a lot of their wealth. And so it's this middle class of business owners, commercial entrepreneurs, as I said, the seafaring merchants who are doing a lot of this trade. This is where a lot of the wealth is, but they historically didn't exist really in a lot of these countries, and so there's no place for them in the political establishment, but they're increasingly the ones paying all of the bills. And so in the French Revolution, for just to give you one example, and we're going to talk about the English Revolution today, so I guess I'll talk about both of them simultaneously. In the English Revolution, in the 1630s, 40s, and 50s, the people who are causing all of the problems in Parliament are these wealthy middle-class people who don't want the king to be able to arbitrarily tax them. Remember the Magna Carta, the great document limiting the king's power, that was really just an agreement between the king and like the very high nobility that, okay, I won't tax you without consulting you. But it left everyone else out. In the case of the French, and as we're going to see, they chop his head off when he won't give them what they want. In the case of the French Revolution, a century and a half later, in 1789, 1793, this kind of same thing is going to happen. You have the king and the nobility, who the king isn't taxing them, so they're pretty much okay with this. But the middle class, the prosperous, wealthy middle class who's getting squeezed, they want political power. They want a say. And this is one of the reasons that, some of you said you're interested in China, this is one of the reasons, one of the 6 different reasons, that the United States started to integrate China into the global economy in the 1980s and 1990s, is because there's this idea of development theory, which says that, okay, you have an absolute monarchy or a one-party dictatorship, and there's no political representation for people. Well, if you make them rich, if you create a prosperous middle class, they will eventually agitate for political rights. And the regime will either have to give them rights, will have to acquiesce to giving them rights by reform, or they'll be overthrown. And this obviously is not what happened, but there were plenty of examples that they could see from their own experiences looking at Western Europe. And so, probably a little bit too much of a Eurocentric theorizing. It certainly did not happen in either Japan, which had modernized and did not democratize successfully. They didn't democratize successfully until the U.S. imposed democracy after World War II and occupied the country. The same thing with Germany. But that's development theory. It's interesting. It's basically once they reach a per capita GDP or a per capita income of about $11,000 a person, they think democratization becomes likely. So, but anyway, that's the idea. As you get this prosperous middle class, in the case of England, in the case of the United States, that's the class who's going to be rebelling against the British. In the case of the French, you had these very wealthy merchants and business people and professionals and middle class people who wanted a say in government, and they wanted a say in government through the legislature. They wanted a representative body where they could get together and debate what taxes and what laws should be happening, instead of them simply being promulgated by the king. So, France developed, we talked about our 2 development tracks, our 2 basic development tracks, because really a lot of them are going to be like kind of hybrid here. Because I talked about the French nobility here, and yes, like on the basic surface, that's what's happening in terms of them becoming economically marginalized. In reality, a lot of times they were kind of dabbling in business, or they were marrying their sons and daughters off to like wealthy merchants, and the merchants who were really wealthy would buy nobility and things like that. But just as like an introductory understanding of this, there are 2 basic development paths. And the first one we're going to talk about here is absolute monarchy. This one's going to develop under the Bourbons. The Bourbons. This is one of your questions on the quiz, and it's a question on the test. In the 17th and 18th century, France is consolidated into an absolute monarchy under the Bourbons. This was a project that had been started to be attempted by their predecessor family, which they're the cadet branch of this former family. I won't get into European nobility. Basically, there was this family called the Valois. The Valois, who had been ruling France for some time. Their line dies out and it passes to the Bourbons. This is in the late 1500s, right after the French Wars of Religion. And so it's the Bourbons who are interested. Don't fall for that, because Valois is one of the choices, but it's Bourbon. Bourbon. The Bourbon, I should say French Bourbon. Yes, they are the Bourbons. Louis XIII and his chief minister, Cardinal Richelieu. I believe I mentioned Richelieu in the context of the 30 Years' War. He is the villain in the Three Musketeers. They're going to concentrate power in the hands of the king. They're fighting the 30 Years' War at this time, and they're also fighting to suppress their nobles, because again, fighting a war is very expensive, and the French king is sucking money out of the country to fight this war. And essentially what happens is the nobility seize on popular discontent, right? Because I said that the nobles can't really be taxed that much, but the nobles don't like that the king and his minister are centralizing a lot of the power and decision making and reorganizing the army so that it basically is under the direction of the king. Remember, we said this is the period where we're getting more infantry, more gunpowder weapons, so the nobility matters less and less to the power of the king. They don't like this. They understand that it threatens them, threatens their autonomy. And so they basically exploit the population being mad because they are getting taxed, their sons are getting impressed into the army, they are the ones being taxed. And again, and food, there's some bad harvests. A lot of times when we see revolutions happen, 1848, 1789, what we'll find is that food had been scarce. So keep the people fed. But they're going to be putting down the nobility and what are called the Frondes, the Frondists, the first and second Fronde. These were uprisings of the nobility. Right as Louis XIII is dying, and his chief minister, Cardinal Richelieu, these were the guys who had been the architects of the 30 Years' War intervention, they both die. And what you get is a child, Louis XIV on the throne with a new minister. And any time in history you get a child ruler, the smart money says trouble. It's not that it always happens, but like most of the time, trouble happens. And of course the nobility seize on this new minister and this boy king. Now's our chance. They are crushed. They are crushed. And this guy, the son of Louis XIII, actually becomes very important to French history because he is the great centralizer, the great despot, if you will, the modernizing, enlightened despot. They talk about this in your book, The Enlightened Despot, sort of the absolute ruler who doesn't believe that he should share power. He is divinely appointed. His power comes from God. But as the godly, divinely appointed ruler, he has responsibilities to you. He needs to better your lives. So he's trying to create modernizing reforms. He's trying to rationalize the French state and grow the economy and make life generally better for the working people. However, he's going to do this by himself. He's going to stop convening the Estates General. This was sort of the advisory body that's made up of the clergy, the aristocracy, and the working people. These are the three estates, and this is what we're going to come back to in 1789 when King Louis XVI, who is his great grandson. Yeah, it's his great grandson. He's going to run out of money, basically. They fight too many wars. King Louis XVI, for all of the modernizing and centralizing that he does in France, he can't stop fighting wars. And I think this is one of the big criticisms of centralized rule is there are not enough checks and balances to prevent the executive from starting wars. And he starts a ton of wars and he loses pretty much all of them, except the war for the Spanish succession, but that costs way too much money. And he puts France hopelessly in debt. This, he does reign though for 72 years. 72 years, from 1643 to 1715. Prior to the recent death of the English Queen, he was the longest living monarch in European history. And frankly, I just kind of feel like, who gets into those debates about like Tom Brady and Joe Montana, Michael Jordan, what do they always say? It's different eras. can't compare them, right? I feel like, come on, this dude was living in the middle of the back then, medicine was, well, sire, it appears that you have ghosts in your blood. We'd better drain all your blood out. Like, she had modern medicine. I just feel like different eras. Different eras. This guy was the longest reigning monarch, 72 years. This is one of your quiz questions. The longest serving monarch in European history prior to the recent death of the English Queen. It was King Louis XIV, also known as the Sun King, and that's that sporting fellow right there. Yes, he wanted to centralize power. The Spanish crown had a similar tendency, and it produced a similar outcome. And I'll talk a little bit about this before I jump over to talking about the limited constitutional path of state development. Because yes, in the short run, I would argue, there are a lot of advantages to centralizing rule because you are streamlining all decision making. You are able to orient the state in one direction and get it to move quickly in one direction. However, there's a problem with that. Number one, if this one person is making mistakes, there's really no check on that. And as I said, he makes a lot of mistakes, and they're very costly. Number two, one of the ways that you centralize power here is you buy off problematic groups. What did he do with the nobles? He got rid of their taxes, right? He gets rid of their taxes, and he says, look, I'm going to be in charge, and but I'm not going to bother you, really. Like with taxes, so just mind your own business, do your own thing, and just stay out of my way. Seems pretty reasonable. Not the worst deal in the world. And this is kind of the same thing that's going to happen in the case of Spain. And they're going to, so the problem here is you're not negotiating with the wealthy members of your kingdom to get regular tax revenue going. So you're forced to rely on expediences. Things like, in the case of the Spanish, just financing all of your military operations and things from the gold and silver that you're sucking out of South America. In the case of in the case of the French, just borrowing tons of money and squeezing your peasantry and just rolling over these huge debts. In the case of the British government and the Dutch government, as we see the constitutional government, what they do is the monarch, the ruler, the stadtholder, in the case of the Dutch, is they say, look, okay, if you guys will provide me with regular revenue and finance our debts and stuff, I will grant you this list of rights and protections. Like there are things that I simply will not be able to do. You will have a say in government and here, write it all down. And so this is a way, I would argue, yes, it takes more time. Yes, it is more fraught. You know, you can wind up having a civil war, possibly. But as we saw, there were plenty of military problems within France itself. But I would argue that long term, it creates a more stable foundation for your rule because it's built more on agreement. Not that everyone is always going to agree with the policies, but at least there is a place where everyone can debate, and it creates a sense of legitimacy for the government, that the government is not simply being imposed upon you, that you are in some way participating in it. So this is something that both the Spanish crown and the French crown do not do, and I'll just pull this up here real quick to show you. Oh, oops, sorry. As we can see here, this is I have to give credit here, this chart here, which is really cool. I use it in a lot of classes. It comes from a book by Ray Dalio, who's a very successful macroeconomic trader for many years. And he had this book called Changing with, what is it? Changing World Orders. Something. If you Google Ray Dalio, it's like principles for changing principles for dealing with changes in the world order or something like that. It's a solid book, and it's a popular book that's very accessible if you're interested in kind of the broad arc of history and sort of how things change. And he's very interested in how economies rise and fall and how states rise and fall. And he has this really cool chart here. And as you can see, they're color coded to represent the various countries in question. And it's estimating relative power between states. And what he does here is he creates an index that's based on economic power, how much your economy can produce, financial power. This here is largely concerned with your currency. What share of the world percentage does your currency occupy? So like for the US dollar, you know, I think 92% of transactions globally are done in the dollar still, something like that. It's gone down a little bit, but military power, population. So he's looking at all this and creating an index saying, like, here's basically your state power projection possibilities. And where's Spain? Here's Spain. As we can see, Spain, they take the shortcut. They just finance everything on the gold and silver that they're sucking out of things, blow it all on military boondoggles, never are able to reform and create an effective modern state. Part of this is geography. Spain is wonderfully mountainous, very, very difficult. And so as you can see, a parabolic increase and then a crash. Portugal, he doesn't even have Portugal on here, same thing basically. But here is, where's the United Kingdom here? The United Kingdom, as you can see here, power starts growing, and they have their revolution which creates a constitutional monarchy, and their power continues to grow, and it's only after they fight some foolish world wars that they destroy themselves. And then, where's the other one here? The United States, right here, as you can see, pretty much straight up here. So, very interesting stuff. The Netherlands, this is an interesting one here. The Netherlands is going to be one of those states that we see follows the constitutional development path. The problem is they and the English are growing up right side by side across the English Channel from one another, and they're very similar powers. They're both on the way to being constitutional republics, constitutional states, I should say. Technically, the British are going to have constitutional monarchy. The Dutch have an actual republic. But they're both commercial empires, and what happens here is they fight 3 wars with each other, and the English win, and that destroys Dutch power. So that's what eliminates them from the contest. They were a big time rival. So it's just an interesting graph here. So as you can see, for most of history here, China was really, if we were to draw some trend lines here, we would see that China is easily the most powerful through history, and that really, and we're going to come back to this. Remember, I left China in the year 1800 when they were still the wealthiest, most powerful developed country on earth. But as we can see here, they really are going to start declining sharply here. In the 19th century is just very, very bad for them, especially as you can see here by about the mid 19th century, and they hit rock bottom here after the Second Sino-Japanese War. Much of Japanese military power during World War II was tied up on the Chinese continent. It's just something that we hardly talk about when we teach the war to high schoolers, but like 35 million Chinese got killed in that. 35 million. That's a number that just doesn't even make sense, right? Like, you try to think about 35 million people. Who's been to like U of M Stadium? It's like 100,000 people in there, right? Imagine that just getting wiped out time and time again. Like, it's just incredible. And I mean incredible in like the unbelievable, hard to imagine way. But anyway, so that's an interesting graph for you, Ray Dalio. Yes, I will talk about that in just a second. And let's say goodbye to King Louis XIV, the Sun King. Remember him, the Bourbons. They were the ones who effectively centralized power in the 17th and 18th century. So, the French monarchy, they really are able to hold back many of the democratic advances of neighboring nations like the Netherlands, like Great Britain, because of the centralized power and personal authority of Louis XIV. He's really going to greatly elevate France's influence on the world. We'll look at French colonial holdings, and he increases the power of the monarchy. He also, I know a lot of you are Protestants, correct? Are there any Catholics in here? No, all Protestants. Well, he also revokes the Edict of Toleration. Basically, at the end of the French religious wars, there was this thing called the Edict of Nantes. And it had said, hey, it's okay if you're a Protestant, you can practice Protestantism here, it's okay. It's totally cool. You don't have to worry about persecution. Well, he gets rid of that. And it leads to a lot of French Huguenots French Protestants leaving France. And it's just, one of those dumb policies where if he had someone to restrain him and say, well, sire, they really got a lot of money, a lot of brain power, they're very thrifty, good business people, maybe we not do this, but he does. And a lot of them go to Holland, a lot of them come to the United States, and they take their talent and their money elsewhere. So, constitutional states. Constitution states, yes. And this gentleman is Oliver Cromwell. Anyone here Irish? Is anyone here of Irish background? Okay, I'm of Irish background too, so you should hate him. So, constitutional states, like Britain, these shared power between hereditary monarchs and legislative bodies that represent some of the people. Some. Again, like we are talking about representative bodies, yes, but it is maybe 5% of the population, right? It is because it's the people who control the wealth and the land who are thought to have a stake in the country. If you didn't own property and you didn't own business and you didn't pay taxes, you basically have no say in running the country. This was the thinking here. You have no stake in the country. Only the people who own the country and who pay to run the government have a right to a say in the government. This was, this is something that even to the American founders is going to be, well, yes, of course, this is perfectly obvious. It's not until the 1820s and 1830s and the advent of Jacksonian democracy, which I will probably talk about because the United States is the first state to have universal white male suffrage with no property or tax qualifications. Because initially, the American founders, they're thinking the same thing. They're thinking, well, the only people who should be able to vote are the people who own the land, physically, who own the country, and who pay for the government. And if you don't do that, well then, you basically shouldn't have a say in the government. So, when I say constitutional states, representative bodies, understand that we're talking about a very small percentage of people who are represented in these bodies, and these were the people who were represented, and that was the political thinking behind the reason. In Britain's case, the legislature is called Parliament, and their great power was taxation. And the idea here was, okay, the king can promulgate whatever laws he wants. This is true even before that he had become a strictly constitutional monarch. This won't happen until 1688 and the Glorious Revolution, when they bring in a Dutch king. But even prior to that, the idea was, and this is going to be what causes the Civil War, 1642 to 1649, is King Charles wants to execute certain policies, but he doesn't want any input from Parliament. And so when he calls Parliament, now we're used to Parliament sitting all the time, right? We have an election, they're in Parliament, and that's just what happens. Well, back then, you only called Parliament if you wanted something. Just like the Estates General in France. You only called them if you wanted something. And so the French kings aren't going to call an Estates General for 150 years. I think at 1624 they call one, and then they don't call another one until 1789. And so this is one of the reasons that things get totally out of control in the French case is King Louis XVI says, hey, everybody, so glad you're here. In a pinch, need some money, let's have it. And they're like, hold on a second. We haven't been called in a century and a half. We have a few demands for you. This was your opportunity to present the king with your grievances and say, King, we understand that times are tough, need some money, but we need this from you. And so then they'd kind of haggle, and the king, depending on how badly he needed the money, in the case of King Charles, he super needed the money because he had accidentally provoked a series of wars that he now couldn't pay for, so he really needed the money. They might or might not do it. And in the case of the English, Charles is unwilling to really grant anything to Parliament. He almost makes Parliament chop his head off, to be honest. They really are trying very hard not to, but he's just Charles really believed in the divine right of kings and the divine right of monarchy, and he looked at Europe and at Louis the 13th and Louis the 14th and was saying, this is the way. This is how kings are supposed to be able to act. We are God's appointed ruler, and who are you to question our authority? The English, of course, though, are saying no. We have this whole constitutional tradition behind us that says that French king and that says English kings are supposed to be bound by Parliament, and Parliament has control over the money, the purse strings. There's a lot of debate about whether or not that's actually true. Some scholars argue that that they kind of made up a lot of this stuff and just kind of tried to hold fast to it. The same thing is true in the American case. The American, and by American I mean the British North American revolutionaries, their interpretation of English constitutionalism very much harkens back to this as well. This very interesting idea that there's no taxation without representation, which wasn't like codified anywhere. It was just kind of declared and assumed, and then they fought over it, and they happened to win. That is actually something you'll find a lot. King Louis XIV, he had something emblazoned on his cannons. It said the king's final argument. So meaning that, like, if I can't convince you with my words, I will convince you with force. And so that's often how these debates wind up getting settled, when sides will not compromise. But of course you should compromise because war is horribly expensive and destructive. But anyway, Britain is going to fight a terrible civil war over this question. Actually, this is more people as a percentage of the population are going to be killed in this English Civil War than will be killed again until I think it's World War I. I don't even think they lose this percentage of the population during the Napoleonic Wars. So it's absolutely bloody and horrible. And right at the heart of it are a troublesome set of Protestants known as the Puritans. He is one of them. These are the commercial, rising merchant class who want more of a say in government. They're dominating Parliament. They're dominating Parliament at this point, and they're trying to rein in this king, who part of it is they feel like he's trying to drag them back into Catholicism, which isn't strictly true, but that is one of their great fears. Popery. But the Puritans had a very strict interpretation of Christianity. They wanted to purify the Church of England, which they felt was still, trapped again in sort of Catholic ritual and whatnot. And this is actually part of what provokes the war that causes Charles to need so much money, is he tries to impose a new prayer book on the Presbyterian Scots. And so they invade England, and he needs money. But yes. A Puritan-dominated Parliament army, led by Oliver Cromwell, beats the Royalists on the battlefield, and they ultimately execute Charles in 1649. This leaves them in a bit of a pickle, though, because they need a government, and so they essentially create what's called the Commonwealth, but it's really a military dictatorship, headed by Oliver Cromwell. They're British, so they can't really call it a military dictatorship, but it really was. The army was the only functioning institution there was, and it was under the control of Cromwell, and Cromwell ran the country. And things fell apart after Cromwell's death in 1659 because his son was simply seen as an unsuitable replacement. Things weren't going terribly well, and they wind up inviting the Stuarts. These are the Stuart kings. They wind up inviting the Stuart kings back. But when the Stuarts come back, in the words of the Bourbon a century later, they had learned nothing and forgotten nothing. They come back, start behaving in the exact same way. Eventually, they depose James II in 1689 and invite Mary and William, Prince of Orange, over from the Dutch Republic to take the throne in a peaceful transfer of power. 1688, the Glorious Revolution. The Glorious Revolution. This is one of your exam questions, the Glorious Revolutions. This is sort of the beginning of true constitutional monarchy in England, because they have to sign sort of a grant saying that we recognize, it's a Bill of Rights. It's a Bill of Rights that they sign as a grant saying that, yes, we swear that we will never behave like the bad old Stuart kings did. And so that is, they'll set up a lot of very interesting institutions. This is the beginning of parliamentary supremacy, where Parliament is slowly but surely going to eventually assume most of the powers of government. So, let me see here. Was there anything else I want to say? Yep. Yep. And the important principle that it establishes here is that the law does not emanate down from the king, but that the law is above the king. And so, rule of law. Rule of law. This is something that if you read the literature, what do you need to have a successful, flourishing economy and society? Well, you need the rule of law. You can't have the arbitrary confiscation of property, which I don't know if that's how you guys think about like taxes or things like that, but that is certainly, when the king called for money, that is how they viewed it. They viewed it as the king stealing their property. They hadn't agreed to this, and so the idea now was that there has to be this open deliberative process that follows this set of common practices that are acknowledged to be legitimate in order for taxes to be legitimate. And the taxes had to come from Parliament, where the people were represented. And something interesting here, this is something that we're going to revisit in the context of the American Revolution. Yes, it's true. Only a very, very small percentage of people were actually in Parliament. Only a slightly larger number could actually vote for the people to go to Parliament. It's a very small number. But they had this idea of virtual representation. It meant that, unlike today, where we think of our district rep representing our interests, like they're our guy or gal, they're our person, they go to Washington to represent us, that wasn't how they conceptualized it. They conceptualized it as, when you go there, you are representing the national interest. It's why you didn't have to live in the place that you represented. You could live anywhere. That's still the case today. You don't have to live in England when you get elected. You don't have to live in the place that elected you, where you ran. So it's just kind of interesting. And they're going to argue when the Americans say, hey, no taxation without representation. We don't have representation there. They're going to say, you do though. You're virtually represented. And they think very little of this argument, of course. And of course, I think they're probably right. So let's move along then. So the absolutist track of European state development and the constitutional track of state development. Eventually, they're all going to get on the constitutional track of state development, but it's going to take revolutions in virtually every case. We saw that it took a revolution in the case of the English. It's going to take a revolution. It's going to take 4 revolutions in the case of the French. In the case of the Dutch, because I kind of just like threw them in there like, now we have a Dutch Republic. That had come about because they were revolting from the Spanish Habsburgs. It was something I just kind of had to skip over. There's what's called the 80 Years' War, and it's the Spanish Habsburgs. Spain's over here, Dutch are right here. They're trying to hold on to these colonies, and were there 16 of them? I think there were 16. 16 different little provinces, and they're very rich. They're very rich. It's full of just great river networks, and it was where lots of banking and commerce was happening. It's a very wealthy area, so the Habsburgs want to hold on to it. But there's a revolt, and the French helped them revolt because the French are encircled by the Habsburgs because they have Spain and Austria, and so there's complicated things happening there. But basically, they joined together in this confederation of provinces with sort of a representative house, and they don't want a king because they're all equal, and so that's where the Dutch Republic came from. Is they united together to fight off the Spanish. So, okay. All right. Let's wrap up the history of European colonization of the Americas. Nice timeline here. Who's been to St. Augustine in Florida? Yeah? Earliest European settlement in the Americas. 1565. That was the first permanent European settlement on the North American coast, St. Augustine, Florida. 1604, the French, they established one at Nova Scotia. This is Quebec, city of Quebec. So the French presence in Quebec. 1607, the English land in Chesapeake Bay. So as we can see, 1492 is a long time prior to this. Again, we kind of truncate these things as we look back into the past, like, oh yeah, that was, 1650 and 1720, basically right next to each other. No, this is a long time. So we don't get the first settlement in the first permanent settlement in North America till 70 years after Columbus set sail. The French aren't landing in Canada for well over 100 years. Same with the English at Chesapeake Bay. Important to note, a lot of these were commercial ventures. A lot of these were commercial ventures. The Chesapeake Bay Company, they're eventually going to set up tobacco. There was no tobacco in Europe, and so they're going to be harvesting tobacco and sending tobacco back over. Pocahontas, anybody? The movie? Has anyone seen the Disney movies, Pocahontas 1 and 2? Remember John Rolfe? The guy he's one of the big tobacco plantation owners, and that's who she winds up marrying, and so there you go. That's the tie in there. The French, up in Quebec, they're interested in things like furs, things like fisheries, phenomenal fisheries over there, and you can salt this fish and send it back to Europe, really improve the diet. I didn't put it on here, but way over on the other side of the continent, over by Alaska, you have Russian fur traders and trappers and fishers starting to penetrate into the Aleutian Islands and Alaska. And they're over here, kind of penetrating down there. And so it's kind of interesting. That's who the United States buys Alaska from, is the Russians. So they almost make it all the way down to California. Maybe they did make it to modern California. They make it a good way down the coast. So the English are going to try to set up colonies. There are a lot of issues here. There are a lot of issues. Number one, you have things like not being very knowledgeable about local conditions or how to survive. I mean, you have to imagine these people are showing up on the coast of this country that they don't know anything about. And who's been to New England during the winter time? Who's familiar? Okay. So just imagine you show up in the fall in New England, and then you get hit by this horrible winter. Like, the mortality rate was exceedingly high. And in fact, some of the early settlers only survived because some local Native Americans helped them to survive. Throughout the early history of English settlement in North America, colonial authorities regularly tried to hush up this high mortality rate because the English wanted you to go there. They wanted you to go and establish a presence in North America because the more of your people you could put in a place, it could ward off possible imperial rivals, right? So you wanted people to go there, and you didn't want to tell them, well, 1 in 5 of you are going to die for sure, and 3 of 5 of you are probably going to die. You wanted to tell them, no, there's gold buried everywhere, it's panacea, phenomenal, you'll love it. No, it was very harsh. Discipline was quite intense. But this one big difference between English colonial practices and French colonial practices and Spanish colonial practices especially is in the case of the Spanish, when they were settling, conquering and setting up shop in South America. Remember, it was the conquistadors, the loyal soldiers of the Spanish monarchy who were being granted these huge tracts of land, right? These large plantations. They were basically setting up feudalism, the feudalism that they had in Spain, and taking it and transplanting it to South and Central America. This is not what's going to happen in the North Americas. What's going to happen is actually the British, they don't want to send their loyal good subjects there. They kind of want to send like their religious dissenters there. The people who are problematic in the home country, they actually want to send them over to the colonies. So that's one of your exam questions also, because they spend a good deal of time talking about it in your book, the differences in colonial practices there. So the English at Plymouth, yes, war, yes, there is a lot of that, yes. So the wars. Let me see. Let me see. Yes, I'll say this really quickly. 1620. 1620 is when the Puritans, people we call the Pilgrims on the Mayflower, that's when they get there, 1620. And they get a royal charter to set up a colony. This is what you did, is you petitioned the crown to grant you lands to set up a settlement. And then there would be individual farming plots. And so again, it's important to understand the difference in social and economic and political development to explain why you have these divergent outcomes. Like, you're wondered why The North American colonies became very rich and democratic and prosperous, and the colonies of South America and Central America did not. There are many books written on the subject. This is all part of it. Is you have these small-holding farmers who have a personal incentive in being thrifty and productive and growing the economy and establishing property rights, whereas in South America it was basically just large plantation agriculture, focusing on just growing a cash crop, one single cash crop, like sugar or coffee or cotton, for export on the world market. And a lot of times it would be absentee landowners too. You would have people who never set foot there, who lived in Madrid or who lived in Paris, who never set foot on their property down there. And part of that was because of we talked about the germ, the possibility of getting disease and dying. A lot of times we talk about the diseases the Europeans brought with them to the Americas, which were of course very deadly. But the same thing was true about the Europeans. When they went to the Caribbean, when they went to South America, there were a lot of diseases there that they had no contact with, that they had no immunity to, and so, very high mortality rate there as well. So, the British colonists, again, they were focused on raising things like crops, sheep, starting family farms. As you moved down south, though, you encountered larger grants, larger tracts of land, and this is going to lend itself more to plantation agriculture, which again helps to explain the divide between development, socio-political and economic development between North and South, which we'll talk about much more in the context of the American Revolution. Okay, wars. Yes, there were a lot of wars. They were very small, limited clashes. I mean, you don't have to imagine the Native Americans fighting them with bows and arrows. Of course they were, but there was a lot of gunpowder weapons going on. As you can see, the French and the English have penetrated this area for multiple decades. They're trading them weapons and things of this nature. So there are a lot of wars. There's a gross disparity though in the number of deaths. I won't go into all the wars, but the Powhatan Wars, the Pequot War, the Beaver Wars, King Philip's War. King Philip's War in 1675 is actually probably the most successful one in terms of the Amerindians. It's an uprising there in the New England area, but even so, they aren't able to drive the English out. They actually lose, sources are, when you're looking at battlefield reports from, the late 1700s or the late 17th century, you kind of take them with a grain of salt, but 5-to-1 fatalities. That's basically the end of it. What the tribes are going to be doing after that, mostly, is allying themselves with either the French or with the British North Americans. And ultimately, they're going to come down on the side of the French because of the pattern of settlement. Remember, the French are up in Canada, which, Canada, what should I say about Canada? Future 51st state of the Union. Okay. Canada, it's a lovely place, but there is a reason that 90% of its population lives within 60 miles of the American border. Everything up there is it's rugged. It is just not hospitable to settlement and to commerce. And so remember, it's just like individual traders, small trading companies, as opposed to the British American presence, which is large-scale communities, cities, families, farms. One of these two looks more threatening. Is it the handful of guys who are just trading with you, trapping some animals, they come and go, or is it these large permanent settlements that are slowly creeping inland, right? Slowly building out? They ally with the French. This leads to the First World War, which was the 7 Years' War. The 7 Years' War. It's the first truly global war. We call it the French-Indian War. We call it the French-Indian War because we're Americans, and so we have to have a special name for everything that focuses attention on ourselves. It was the French-Indian War. to the Europeans and whatnot, it was the 7 Years' War, and it was the First World War. What do I mean by First World War? It means that they fought in Europe. They fought in East Asia. They fought in the Caribbean. They fought on the North American continent. It's really an incredible war. And the English ultimately win, I would argue, and here I'm just repeating what has become the historical consensus among professionals, is that because of the constitutional settlements that Britain had undergone, it was able to finance large-scale war on a long term much better than the French. And that's it. The Bank of England. The Bank of England was the greatest military weapon that the British had, because they were able to finance lots and lots of debt at very, very low rates. One of the studies that's very important in this is they found that in the 18th century, the 1700s, this is when the British and French are fighting their 800 wars for supremacy of the world, which culminates in 1815 with the defeat of Napoleon at Waterloo, and the British win the world for the next 100 years. They estimate that Britain was able to borrow money at half the interest rate of the French crown. That the British were able to borrow money at about 4%, whereas the French crown was borrowing money at about 8%. This is a huge difference when we're talking about borrowing millions and millions and millions over decades and decades and decades. And it's going to be debt and economic stagnation and bankruptcy that destroys the French monarchy in 1789. And the American War for Independence, which the French helped finance and fight, that's going to be kind of the straw that breaks the camel's back. But this was a really horrible war for them. They lose, the French lose. That's how the French lose Canada. That's how Canada becomes a British possession, is the French-Indian War. The French-Indian War, the 7 Years' War, this is also going to be Pauline Maier, who's a very good American historian. I actually think she passed away a few years ago now, though, but she's a very excellent historian. She and other of Bernard Bailyn's pupils have said that essentially, when we really step back and look at the American Revolution, it kind of starts with the end of the 7 Years' War, the French-Indian War. Because it was the American colonists spreading westward into these contested lands with the allied French Indian tribes that sparks off the war. It's actually young George Washington serving in the British military that accidentally sort of has this kind of standoff where some French officers get killed by his allies, and that sort of sparks the war there. And then in Europe, there's another catalyst. But essentially, the British are going to come back to the Americans and say, the British Americans, the British North Americans, and say, hey, listen, great job in that war, guys. It was awesome. We crushed the French. We hate those guys. This is great. But here's the thing. We're in tons of debt, borrowed a lot of money, which isn't a problem. We got it financed, but we need you to start helping pay. We need to start helping us pay. Because this is another major difference between the colonial practices of the Spanish on the one hand and the English on the other hand. The English were sending all their troublemakers over here, their religious dissenters, and people were setting up commercial activities, and there's trade going on, but they aren't really taxing them. The British government doesn't view this as an extractive operation. By contrast, this was always the case with the Spanish. They were always sucking resources and taxes out of this place. Well, it's when the British government finally tries to start taxing their colonies here, which they had not been doing previously, that the British Americans object. They object and say, hey, you can't tax us without our consent. And so there was this period of benign neglect, they called it the period of benign neglect, where essentially Britain hadn't been minding the colonies, and they got used to doing things themselves. They set up local parliaments. They were essentially local parliaments. In Virginia, it's called the House of Burgesses. And it's where James Madison sat, it's where Thomas Jefferson sat. And it was a local assembly of the landowning and tax-paying class where they would get together and say, okay, we're going to need to build this road, so we're all going to chip in £5, and so we're going to build the road. They said, we have our own representative institutions that are in charge of taxing. And so there you go. That all stems from the war, which the British government kind of feels like you guys did kind of start that, and we did kind of fight it for you, and maybe you could pitch in a little bit. And so it's very funny. The parliamentary debates are very funny because you even have people like Edmund Burke, the famous British conservative, who is very pro-American, pro-British American, thinks they have a point, thinks that Parliament should just say, hey, yeah, you can, as long as you follow our lead on foreign policy, you can manage your internal affairs. But even he says, it's difficult to take the Americans seriously when they talk about being oppressed, because no people has ever been better treated in the entire history of the world than these, landowning, George Washington types. Is saying, the idea that they're oppressed is just crazy. No one has ever lived better in the whole history of the world than these Americans are living. So, which I think is true. So the contrast between Spanish and British colonization. We'll talk more about the American colonies here on Thursday with the American Revolution, which will segue beautifully into the French Revolution, which we won't get into. That will be. I stopped. If you read the chapter already for this week, you'll see that toward the end they introduce the French Revolution. I don't want you to read that part. I want you to stop after the American Revolution, because the French Revolution really kicks off the 19th century. The American Revolution is very much a war of the 1700s in every aspect. The French Revolution, and it's a very local event. Yes, there are carry-on effects, with the British government and their reforms and causing the French monarchy to have financial difficulties, but it's really, for us as Americans, it's like the world event, right? But in the grand context of world history, it's not like that central. The French Revolution, though, is going to lead to a whole bunch, like boom, 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 like direct domino effect that produced the 19th century. And so there's a series of books by a British historian, The Age of Revolution, The Age of Capital, The Age of Empire, that basically presents 1789 to 1914 as like one long, continual chain of obvious events. And he calls it the long 19th century. And that's sort of become an accepted view of the situation. And it's one that I myself am going to follow. So we'll pick up week after next, after the exam, with the French Revolution, and then we'll carry all the way up to World War I, which will be our stopping point for exam number 2. And then we do the 20th century, which is most of the final exam. Most of the final exam is over the 20th century. There will be some questions from the first 2 exams. Really just the high points, the big things. But just to wrap up, the differences between Spanish and British colonization, because I don't think I'm really going to touch on the Spanish again after this. As you saw, the Spanish, their day is pretty much done here. We won't really talk about Spain again until the Americans are kicking them around down here at the start of this century. Then we'll talk about what happens. How did we get all these independent states down here? That's actually a product of the French Revolution, actually. Napoleon's conquest of Spain destabilizes the situation. So let's just wrap up here with differences in colonization with the few minutes I have left. The contrast between Spanish and British colonization in the Americas, very, very stark. We've talked about them. Everything from who they were sending over there, to what kind of political structures they had set up, to the kind of racial hierarchies that emerged. All of these things lead to different social, economic, and political developments in the hemisphere. So remember, who the settlers were, how they governed, how they worked the land, and the nature of their relationship to the people. Spain was applying basically the same model of feudalism that they had brought with them from Spain to the Americas. They have the large church, they have the large plantation owners, the encomienda, and then they have the Catholic Church coming with them, looking to proselytize. So it was very much feudal and kind of a crusading ethic that's going on there. The British were using their colonies as havens for religious dissenters and as a safety valve to reduce the number of poor in England. Just think about England. It's a tiny little island, right? And actually, the situation is more stark than that when you realize that this top half of it, right here, and I'm sorry, this is very small, that top half of it's not England. That's Scotland. And this over here, this is Ireland, which is full of Irish people. So really, you just have this kind of small area here. And as England is industrializing in the 18th century, we talk about the Industrial Revolution as part of the 19th century, but it happens first in England, really. It's going to lead to the growth of cities, moving people off the land into cities. Well, if you have large collections of poor, unemployed people, is that that's good for social and political stability, right? No, you gotta get them out of here before they cause some trouble. So you set them up with a little farm in New England, you know? And so that's what they're using it as, a place for religious dissenters and as a place for population, excess population to go. The real troublemakers, the actual criminals and stuff, they'll eventually start dumping them in Australia. So that is, Australia basically gets started as a large penal colony. Massachusetts Bay, that's the big settlement. Massachusetts Bay, if you want to think of, there's this sort of tension in the American experience between like, sort of, if you will, the better angels of our nature, sort of that religious foundation. That's the Puritans up here in Massachusetts Bay. And then down here in the Carolinas, you have and in Virginia, you have the corporations that are being set up, the actual trading companies who view America not as a place to build, you know, God's kingdom on earth, which is what John Winthrop and guys like that are thinking up here in Massachusetts. They're thinking this is a place to set up shop and make some money. So there's this kind of tension in the American experience between sort of this religious impulse and this commercial impulse, which really form the core, I think, of American identity there. Differences in how they governed. The Spanish and British were governing their colonies very different. Remember, the Spanish crown was sending governors directly into the colonies that they controlled, sending governors trying to trying to govern them and make laws. Remember I talked about how when they try and create protections in Spain, in the metropole is like the capital of the empire, the metropole says, hey, we hear you're treating the indigenous very poorly down there, so we've got some laws now for how you need to treat them. And so they send the viceroy down to tell the local landowners, the local bigwigs, here's what you need to do, here's what the government wants you to do. And they, if they don't like it, they maybe lynch you, right? Which happens. The British colonies, though, during this period, we're talking about benign neglect. Let them govern themselves. The British, remember, are busy during this period having a civil war, right? Just think about the period that we're talking about here. We're talking about the 1620s. They're landing here. In the 1620s, this is right as things start to heat up domestically in England. And if we think about the Glorious Revolution and the wars with the Dutch and all that stuff, that won't all be wrapped up until 1700. So you have this long period where they're basically on their own. They're on their own. The British government couldn't really help them and didn't really have a mind to helping them. And so, just these very different experiences lead to different political ideologies. And again, as I mentioned last time, a lot of it too is this idea that, look, we are the landed commercial elites here. We should have a say in the government. And that was it. Are there any questions? Okay. Well, I'll see you on Thursday when we talk about the single most important event in all of world history, obviously, the American Revolution. So, all right. See you then. How'd you guys do?
All right, good.
How was it?